Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along. Thank you to Miller and the Gazelli Art House for inviting me to kindly grill Anthony and Sammy on their work on your behalf, and thank you for coming to listen to what might turn out. Like a lot of these conversations, we tried not to kind of over-rehearse what we're going to say, so it is literally a conversation. I suppose we will talk for some half hour, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to some questions if you have some, so we'd be very pleased to hear them from you. Gosh, it's quite interesting to hear this ominous sound coming from below, from the installation. It sets the tone, doesn't it? It sets the tone. So I think there are several things we want to discuss, and what we wanted to start with, I suppose, is looking at the nature of your collaboration. And I wanted to ask you a question about, the different disciplines from which you come together to make this work. So could you explain a little bit about the background that you come from that allows you to work together, and then maybe your individual roles in how you collaborate? Because when two artists make something, everybody wants to know, well, who's pressing the shutter and who's coming up with the ideas, and how do you divide that labor between you?
Sorry.
So question one, really, a little bit about your respective backgrounds, and question two, how do you divide the labor between you? Okay, so now you can fight it out about who's going to start answering that question.
Well, age before beauty, so.
All right, so, thanks. So, we met in graduate school about 24 years ago. And my background before I went to study art was in theater and performance, which led me to work with video. And I was very involved working with video when I met Anthony, who actually introduced me to photography and to everything I know about photography. I learned from him, even how to print, how to go into the darkroom, and because I wanted to know about it, but I didn't know anything. So that was my background.
And my background in the 80s was a more traditional approach to understanding analog photography, working with large format photography, but right from the start going at it with a more theoretical and conceptual bent, because I was deeply interested in understanding what it was, what it meant, what it did for a culture. So I always approached the photographic practice, even when it was only film-based in the late 80s and early 90s, as a theoretical exercise. So I did a lot of work that was about photography, about popular culture, about media. And I think it was because of those interests we were able to find a synchronicity and a commonality, because he was looking at some of these same issues from another dimension and discipline. So in San Francisco, where we were studying and getting our MFAs, me in photography and Sammy in what was called the New Genres department, this was all pre-digital. Of course, Apple and Google had not yet been
thought about.
But we were coming out of graduate school, art school, at a moment that was prescient for us and for all of us. And it was, I think, the thing itself, the computer, the tool, this new tool that we then embraced as part of our toolkit, that allowed for our common ideas to find a common expression. It was the thing itself that filtered our desires and vision that has now become a single vision. And I know it sounds a bit pathological, but after 24 years of working and living and breathing the same air for so long, that we do now have this singular vision. And it started with the introduction of the computer into our lives and into our work, and how it drove our thinking about how all of us have been shaped so dramatically.
That's interesting. So the computer kind of becomes the common ground in which both things coalesce.
Things can meet.
Right.
But that's something that will be taken on then in terms of our understanding of how everything can be digitized. You know, every aspect of our lives, of our existence, of our perception can be digitized and therefore re-expressed or find a new iteration of its being through this digitizing process. Yes. But that's something that we kind of understood later somehow. Yeah. But I wanted to go back to your original or initial question about how do we collaborate, and I think that what has never ceased from the moment that we met is our conversation. And what is really at the basis of everything, at the beginning of everything, is always a conversation, is an exchange of a news item or an observation around an event or something that triggers our attention, and that becomes then the topic of our conversation, and from the conversation come the kind of ideas, or not even ideas, sometimes there are images, actually, sort of like visual mental images. And then the task of the collaboration is to actually figure out how to translate those mental images into physical objects.
Right.
So that's at the core.
I think you kind of see that conversation in the work. The work allows you as a viewer some space to see there's a dialogue going on. It doesn't. In the nicest possible way, it is not resolved. So not all the questions, the answers are immediately obvious in the work, and that the sense of a conversation is unfolding in the work all the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that would be really a nice way of also creating inviting other people into the conversation. Yes. So it's not just between us, but it becomes between us and our audience. Yeah. So
that's interesting. I never thought of that. The collaborative art works in that way, that the conversation between you is sort of made evident in the work.
We never thought of it either. Yeah. So that's
okay.
No, but it is a privilege, I must say. I can't know how other artists function or think in this way, because we've been doing it for so long this way, but I feel that it's a real privilege that we have been able to engage in this process. The single artist has a different process with the canvas or with the stone or with the photograph. It's the artist and the material, and we are the artist and open to considering what that material might be.
Yes.
So in fact, our field of possibility has been, I think, expanded because we are two. And I think we give each other permission to go somewhere we might not have otherwise.
Right. So it's both a safety net and a way of being able to explore more and push out more.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I suppose... I should have explained, to those of you who don't know, I'm a curator of photographs, and I work at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So my world revolves around, the history of photography and how we deal with placing photography in a cultural institution, looking at its history and its styles and its processes and techniques, but more than that, what the use of a particular process or technique might mean, or why an artist chooses a process or a technique. So, you've chosen in this exhibition to deal with photographically based imagery, but that is really the starting point, because you have moving imagery, you have kind of digital manipulations going on, and so it kind of brings me to my second question, really, which is, we're thinking about this in terms of photography, but I know that you choose many other different types of media to express different messages, and we might talk a little about other work and how you do that. But just to come back to photography, I suppose, which is essentially the starting point of what we're looking at in most of this show, the basic question is, what are we actually looking at the things that are on the wall? What is this physical thing on the wall? How do we describe what it is? And if you could perhaps talk through one of the images and tell us, the basic how of what you're making and what we see on the wall.
Mm.
Well, I would answer by saying that it is a photographic print because it was produced using laser imaging and then processed using traditional chemical processes, so that it has all of the same properties that you would have found in an analog photographic print. So it's not an inkjet print, it's a photographic print because it was made with light and chemistry. So that's
an emulsion. It has an emulsion-based process.
Okay, that take us back. Tell us the story of, for example, this image. What you have this idea. We'll come to what the idea is, but at first we want to find out what this is.
Yeah, I think Martin wanted to go to the beginning, not to the end process.
I was starting with the end part and working backwards.
Right.
So because what we're looking at is a photographic print.
Right.
Technically.
Okay, so it's ostensibly a landscape of some kind.
Yes, and we start with actual. In this series, we start with digital photographs. Okay. In many works related to this series. Prior, we have used actually a view camera, 4x5 film, to shoot the landscape. So we start with the equivalent of a photograph.
Right. So one of you goes out to a real place in the world with a camera.
Yeah, we go with a tripod.
Okay.
And we choose locations or because of settings that we are interested in, specific properties or characteristics that will translate the ideas that we are looking for.
Okay. Yeah. So you've got a digital picture of a place.
Yes.
And then what happens to that?
Well, then we go into the Aziz and Cucher process, which is really something that it's hard to explain without getting overly technical, but it is in the computer, and it's using, I wouldn't say basic Photoshop, but it's using Photoshop plus a few elements that come into play and that are used perhaps in ways that they were not meant to be used as where they were devised. Okay. So it's a little bit of a corruption of the intention of these screening processes and things like that.
Okay.
But what that affords us is basically the ability to break up the image, and that's what we're after. Is to breaking up the image in order to put it back together.
Right.
And it's in that process that then this. It's an imperfect process, so there are gaps, there are missing pieces of information, there are glitches, there are different things that we have learned through the years now to control to a good degree. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's kind of like our own technique that now we can somehow own.
Yeah.
So once that is done, then we go into the, with the final part, which is the printing and the mounting and all that.
Okay, so you're misusing Photoshop and scrambling this information up and
in a way,
pushing the limits of what it can do, or confusing it, I suppose.
Yeah, or what is expected to do.
Right, and that produces this particularly heightened kind of contrast or relief quality in the digital image.
Yes. Yeah. And also this flattening, but at the same time there's a separation, layering that is pretty obvious.
Yeah. And then?
And then, well, we work together on the... You asked earlier who's doing what, and I think that has been left unanswered, but the truth is it's not that we're working next to each other, but we will try separately different attempts at achieving a common goal, which is this fragmentation that Sammy was describing. And there will then be a kind of meeting of the minds where we will look and see what each other is sort of working on and learn from that process. So there's a level of experimentation that will go on individually, and then they'll be emerging, and then we decide together that this would be the right direction for this particular piece.
Because once the image is broken up, then
there are many choices.
There are many choices about how to put it back together.
Okay, so you're sitting together with the computer and you're saying no more red, no less yellow,
yes.
and this looks good.
We're making decisions and in a way denaturalizing the image.
Right, and there's a certain point where it feels right to both of you, and that's
right
ready to go.
Level of corruption has been achieved.
Yeah.
Well, not only of corruption, but aesthetic appeal and the emotional tone that we want to bring. Okay. Which varies depending on the show or depending on the pieces. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then we come to the, I'm sorry to labor the technical side, but I want to kind of get it out of the way so we can talk about what it means. Okay. So, you talked about a kind of etching or a kind of lasering of this.
But that would be in the actual printmaking process itself, using the light jet laser technology that they now have available to produce most of the large format photography that you see in galleries is done with what's either a light jet or a Durst process. And it is an actual laser beam that is driven by the software information, telling it where to and how much to ignite the papers or
burn the image. Basically expose the image onto the emulsion, onto this emulsion that will respond to the light. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So this is a sheet of photographic paper.
Yes.
Traditional chemistry photographic paper.
Yes,
that's right.
Yeah.
So it's a silver-based, light-sensitive paper.
Yeah, and it has a lot of silver.
Yeah,
it's a special paper that is called. It has a metallic finish because it has an extra, quite a high amount of silver in it.
Yeah,
and that's what gives it this particular quality that we are very attracted to.
Right. Mm-hmm. So that's metallic reflective surfaces in the nature of the paper.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are so many questions floating around the why. I mean, we've described the how. I mean, do we feel satisfied?
Well, then there's the glazing and the presentation of the print itself, which for us is important to locate the image in a physical way that floats somewhere between photography, printmaking, and painting, ultimately.
Right.
So it's a hybrid piece, you could say, even though it started as a photographic capture or document. It started as a document and it ended here, which is some conflation of various histories.
Yes. There is a very visceral engagement with the works that I think you only get by seeing them in the flesh. And it's often the case with photography that we're dealing not just with an image, but a physical thing.
Yeah.
And particularly in this body of work, you walk into a gallery and you have a relationship with the work where you see it from a distance and you think one thing or think how it might be made in a particular way, or it makes you feel a particular way. And as you move closer to it, you start to see the breakdown of the image or the reflection in the image and the layering in it. And all of that begins to open up questions about what it might mean, I suppose. And I know you're questioning, how is this made? It's digitally produced, but it's chemically fixed, and then so the metaphorical side of things begin to take over then for me about what we're looking at. So your process seems very linked to the the metaphorical ideas behind their work. So I'd like to get a little bit into what those are and why you choose these subjects and what the ideas are that you're trying to express through the work.
Well, I think you touched on it a moment ago, just when you started to talk about the different points of view that the viewer can have in a gallery situation like this, where you see it from one point, and as you get closer, you discover through an active perception not just more detail, but more complexity and more ambiguity and more abstraction. And I think the choice of the fields in this case, or the vistas of the seaside, are meant to do exactly that, where you have these different understandings of perception through scale and through vantage point, from looking at the piece and then getting closer and discovering something about almost an atomic or molecular detail that comes through the revealing of the pixel, because they're highly pixelated, and there's a decision on our part to reveal that pixelization that metaphorically sort of mimics the molecular structure of the thing that we're shooting.
Yeah, and that goes back in a way to what I was saying earlier about our awareness of this digitizing process as becoming integral to our existence today. And so we see these landscapes through this digitizing process, but we're not hiding it. We're in a way kind of like making it evident, or making it as much part of the thing or the landscape as the other elements that constitute the landscape. So the digitizing becomes one more layer, or one more element in this weaving.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the pixelization allows you to atomize this scene and make you feel like it's a kind of, at the molecular level, you're seeing into the stuff of
what it's made of.
Yes,
but it's not. I mean, it's the stuff of what a photograph is made of.
Right. Yeah. Which is why, as a photography curator, I find that so satisfying, because you're choosing that process very consciously, and it's allied to the work, to the meaning of the work.
Yeah, well, this is the interesting thing, is that you reversed in a way our process by starting to talk about the technique, because in our creative process the idea will come first, and then we will figure out, well, what is the technique, or how do we achieve it? So we think, we realize, the world is atomized, digitized, and how do we represent it? Right. So then we search for the technique to do it. So it's interesting to in our work, always the idea prefigures everything, and then the technique follows.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a kind of conceptual practice way of working, isn't it? I mean, traditional photography, photojournalism, or other kinds of photography, you might go out into the world and shoot, and edit later, and then find out what it was you were actually interested in, and then edit a body of work that has meaning. But this is the kind of the flip side of that.
Yeah, it's a kind of construction that we create.
It strikes me that the work is this idea that it's not resolved physically, not quite the resolution is not there, as we would kind of yearn for it to be in a traditional sense, but also on a kind of metaphorical level, it is not resolved. It's atomized, it isn't complete. Or you're seeing the process of something coalescing. It seems very, again, it's very coherent, that idea, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's something, sorry, man, if I'm hogging the microphone. But that's another kind of persistent idea that has been
in all of our work.
But even in earlier work, the idea of metamorphosis, the idea of bodies in flux, the idea that things are impermanent and could be always changing, and I think that awareness, that's an awareness that we perhaps both had, and in different ways dawned on us that this is how we experience life, and that is evident in the videos downstairs. It's another way of representing that kind of permanent dissolution. Yeah.
And also the in-between state of things, which we've explored in a lot of our work, or a chimerical state where the bodies and the machines are merging together. Where's Clemmy? I don't know. I mean, that's just, if you clicked on chimeras, that's just an older body of work that might act as a kind of footnote for how what we're looking at in the gallery looks very different formally, but in theory is very connected to this state of being in between things, and being very much in flux. And also to the sort of like the perversion of photography in a sense, because you're looking at an impossible object that is absolutely photorealistic.
Yes.
So it kind of creates like this short circuit paradox in your eye about what it is that you're looking at.
Yes, because there's a kind of flesh surface.
Yes,
right. And then there's a kind of mechanistic thing inside this. So with the machine within the organic flesh, what is this thing that we're looking at?
Yeah.
But in a rational level, you understand that it's completely impossible. And I think that sense of paradox is what we're continually pursuing in all of our works, even if it looks very different from one body of work to the next.
Mm-hmm. Can we look at that body of work that I think that when your work first came to my attention was shown in London at the Photographers Gallery?
Yeah. If you click on works, well, the first two, Dystopia, the second one, is that may be what you saw way back in the day at the Photographers Gallery?
Yes. Yeah. So this is a series of heads with all of the sensory input orifices of the body covered.
Sealed.
The ears, the nose, the mouth, and they were a very striking kind of series of images that struck a chord at a moment when we were all feeling anxious about the dissolution of our physical contact with each other as the internet landed on our desks, and
as these things started growing into our ears.
Yes. Right.
Now, this question around anxiety was very prevalent for all of us, and certainly for us as an artistic team. I'm not sure that the work in the gallery is addressing that in the same way. I think some of the pieces may touch on that anxiety, but it certainly hasn't been the prominent discourse for us. Maybe we've arrived at a place of tranquility and
more resolved than yourselves
when it comes to our engagement with technology.
Perhaps, or perhaps I think that at that time these works were done in 1994, so they're going to be 20 years old this year.
Yeah.
There was so much. We were living in San Francisco at the time, and very close to Silicon Valley, where all basically the birth of the internet was happening, and there was so much hype around this idea that this technology was going to. Well, it did change completely. It did completely change our lives, but perhaps. In ways that we did not expect, and there was this the feeling that we had was that the technology, the way it was presented, was a way of reducing the space of contact. Even though it was hyped as something that would bring people together,
a
connector in terms of connectivity. There was something about it that would also shut people in,
right,
or reduce the face-to-face contact with people. And that simple idea of the face-to-face is really what brought these pieces together.
Yeah.
From trying to say, well, what if, evolutionarily speaking, in the future, once you don't have face-to-face contact, your sensory organs will disappear.
Yes.
And that's what would result.
And I think that has been our driving, compelling need to work with photography in the ways that we have is to find a way to distill something very complex into something very simple and straightforward, like the face or the body or the machine or the landscape. And these are really vast, say, problems that societies have faced, and we have not made a lot of work over the years because we've been dedicated to finding a way to distill these complexities into a single image.
Yeah, well,
or body of image.
I suppose photography always comes with that heritage of believability, and we can't quite shift ourselves from that. That initial thing is, oh, okay, I'm seeing a photographic image and there's some element of truth to it, but you know, you're always dealing with that threshold of believability in the images.
But that may change now that we have come to accept digital images, manipulated images, as part of our everyday. You know, a generation away from us, they might not have any concept of this question of believability anymore, or they will accept that every image is possibly real or possibly not. Yeah.
So from this work, there was a kind of looking inwards, like a shutting down and a looking inwards, and then in some ways that you created a set of pictures called interiors, I think, where it turned into a kind of architectural space that was clothed in the flesh.
Right here. Yeah.
It take a little bit longer to load.
These are big images, so patience. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say this was in a way marked the end of a chapter for this work around the anxiety of the body in relation to technology, and it was the birth of this work. We actually found a kind of release when we left the realm of the body through architecture to get to the external world, because we had been sort of trapped in this internal discourse.
Traveled inwards. And
actually getting out here was a big relief for us somehow.
Yeah, you can feel that. You can feel this, the air filling your lungs.
Very claustrophobic work that we had been doing for many years.
Yeah. It feels like you've reached a sort of kind of resolution with, you know, the digital world by doing this. You know.
Well, I guess we found a beauty in it.
There's an undeniable level of like just visceral surface revelry in the beauty of these places. That, you know, I often think it's easy to make difficult looking work that deals with body horror or shock or these kinds of things in a way, because it implies seriousness and we must take it seriously. But it's kind of even harder to make work which just looks beautiful and then just looks beautiful, but then you're, you know, once you start to think deeply into it, there's you've got a whole journey leading up to this work which has a pleasing surface appearance, but there are many layers beyond that, as we've been unpicking here. Do you, the reaction to the work? What have you found that people have come to it with? What are their what are reactions like?
I think generally a sense of mystification and pleasure to just the sheer pleasure of looking, and hopefully it has also been triggering this kind of discourse or sense of narrative that you've just described. We are really hopeful that our work is not merely something to look at, but also something to think about. And we've always tried to keep those two things in check.
It's that pleasure of looking which is, I suppose, often underplayed, because there's a real sense of visual intelligence. You spoke earlier about emotionally where you feel this is the right moment for this image, and there are beyond language. There's so much intuition and sense of rightness in the image that you feel it and you agree this is the point to stop, but you can't quite articulate why. We're trying to circle around this, and as viewers we'll also have that response that we know this is a point where our visual intelligence our visual literacy takes over from our descriptive,
from our
cognitive, rational processes.
Yes.
And I think you really sense that in the work. Can we talk a little bit more about moving imagery? Because we've been dealing with stills and a kind of atomization, and I'd like to ask you about the two pieces downstairs a little more, and the idea of animation. That again is another word which we can use in two different ways on a kind of technical level of animation, what you're doing to make the work, but also on a metaphorical level. So talk us a bit through the process of the pieces we see of the buildings dissolving and rebuilding that we see when we walk in the gallery.
Absolutely. But what I'd like to say that actually the piece in the back is part of a series of etudes that really gave birth to all this whole body of work, even to the buildings.
Yeah,
also.
That's a better link, I suppose. Yes, let's talk about
for us. And it was like Anthony was describing this idea that we could finally break through the skin and look at the world happened through a commission that we received from the Parc de la Villette.
Clement, can you click on Synaptic Bliss video?
Yeah.
Just on that installation in Paris.
And which actually was shown with Gazelli
in the Earth
in the Down to Earth exhibit. And this piece, we've found out that.
I think you can click through it. Oh yeah,
no, that's okay.
Those are stills from the installation.
That's like another storyboard. But we realized that the only way to address what we were trying to accomplish in terms of this complexity of the world outside of the skin or beyond the skin could only be done through moving image, and at that point the idea of animation was not so much about animating a drawing or animating a still or something like that, but actually something that becomes animated because it's infused with life, and we realized that we could take these video shots of landscape of the park, which was where we shot this initial piece, and animate it through this digital process by giving it this quality of breakup, of going inside, of going and looking at the molecularity of it, even though we were not using any scientific instruments to do so, but merely the just what was available to us as editing.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if I may add to that, all of this work in the gallery, as Sammy was saying, is an extension of what you're seeing up here from the Parc de la Villette project, which was also a time when we were struggling with how we might actually represent the journey that we all take through internet space. This flattening of time and space through virtuality. Mm-hmm. And even though it doesn't look like the internet, it was an attempt to somehow mimic, or maybe it's an impossible task to represent the journey of moving through internet space, but this ability to be here and there simultaneously was what we were attempting to do in both the video work, the animation work, and the still work.
Yes. And
what you're seeing in the gallery today is sort of the last attempt at doing that.
Yes.
Yeah. So the buildings are a more recent development, and they were commissioned by the Indianapolis Museum of Art as part of our exhibition, Some People, which was a quite large video installation commission of four pieces, 4 video installations that we finished last year, 2012. And this series of buildings was the first installation, the first part. It functioned in our own narrative of the show as a kind of prologue. Yeah. and it was a way of setting the tone for what was to come, and in the rest of the show, and to establish again our philosophical take on the nature of time and this question of impermanence, and I don't remember now exactly how we arrived at the metaphor of the building as the symbol of this thing that we wanted to express.
Well, what better thing to express, human aspiration to create something monumental and lasting, which over time will just disintegrate.
Click back one more. You can just see how the installation of the architecture was installed differently. In Indianapolis, we had 3 projection screens, and instead of a row as we have downstairs, we had the architectural forms falling and then giving birth to another form. So there was a constant cycle of not rebirth, but a new development.
Yeah.
And so now we're sort of experimenting and playing with different ways of presenting the same imagery to a different effect.
Yes,
as we have downstairs.
In this setting, though, this idea of impermanence and fragility, if you want to call it that way, was really contextualized within a political landscape, which was the theme of the other 3 installations that were part of the show. And those were, this is a moment in our life in which we decided to work more autobiographically, perhaps, and to look into our roots and our own relationship to the Middle East.
Which is typically not something a collaborative team will do, because we tend to respond to the external circumstances, to the world, in a way that tends to be more objective. But instead, in this case, we couldn't not look more subjectively and more personally at these circumstances, even though they're epic problems that we all must contend with. We found a personal connection to it through our own emotional reaction and sort of trauma of what happened in 2006 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and Hezbollah, and the situation at that moment struck a real chord with us because of our own family connections to that region that we found undeniable, frankly. Yeah. And it caught us by surprise that we would then enter into a 6-year project of making work that resulted in that exhibition.
Yeah.
To me, it's a kind of almost completely different visual world. We're dealing here with a kind of work which is, in my mind, very connected with a sort of romanticism in the kind of late 18th, early 19th century sense of the term, of like feeling through the eye, and the culture of nature and man-made things being in opposition, and the world being created through the artist's perception. All of those things are embedded in this kind of work.
No.
And then you have this very performative work, which is quite politicized, and
there you see
it has a kind of comedy to it, and
it surprised us too.
Yeah, tell us about how that came about and who you became these alter egos.
Well, what happened is that the deeper we went into the subject matter, it was like being trapped in this absolutely mad world. The impossibility of dealing with the subject, with the political situation, the irresolution of it, this question of things not being resolved, became like right. Really central to everything that is in this exhibition. It's a different kind of irresolution. It's not the same kind of visual irresolution that you find in the landscapes here, but there is a formal irresolution to things that mimics the kind of political irresolution.
Yeah.
Of the zone.
Essentially, you dressed up as clowns. Right?
Yes. Because we could not feel but stupid.
We were fools. We were the fools.
Yeah.
Playing the fools. touching the subject of peace in the Middle East feels like a really foolish thing to take on as artists. Yeah. But we couldn't stop ourselves from doing it. And we dove deeper and deeper into it, and we couldn't find our way back. And we tried to bring a kind of narrative to it through our own personal stories.
Yeah.
I mean, those, as Sami was saying, the buildings downstairs were presented very specifically within the context of the land work in the show, but really as a form of meditation on time, a very long view of time. So
it was a way of allowing the viewer to somehow escape the reality of this other very kind of jarring works, with these clowns and this. I mean, there are many elements in it. This kind of a harsh documentary about, war in the future, and there were all these pieces to it, and the buildings allowed a kind of, in a way, the romantic escape.
Yeah, that's true.
Through this kind of like thing. Well, history will take care of itself.
Right.
And the title of the piece, which is "Time of the Empress," is actually. A nod to Marguerite Yourcenar and the Memoirs of Hadrian, and even though there's no empress in the memoirs in the book, we did feel that at the end of the book, Hadrian is dying or about to die and gives this long speech about history, about how his impermanence in history and how he will die and another emperor will come and other there's this very beautiful image of how pedestals will hold new statues and those statues will collapse and be replaced by other statues and new buildings and so on and so on, and that speech sort of like became very much impressed in our minds as representing this, what we wanted to say with this work, and we figured that in a way, the empress in this case is basically the philosophy, is the ability to distance yourself from what holds you down hostage to attachments. So anyway, that's a little digression on the title of the piece. Yeah.
Well, as viewers, you keep us on our toes because we a lot of times we're trying to define a signature style for an artist.
We're very bad at
decide. We recognize this and therefore we want it, and it confers value on our judgments, and we can demonstrate that we have taste and so on. But you keep moving around, and we can't quite get hold of that. And I like the idea that you choose the most appropriate vehicle for expression depending on the idea, but we are finding that there are kind of common threads running through the ideas about lack of resolution and coming to terms with lack of resolution, and becoming internalized but atomizing oneself in a physical sense, but also through the virtual world. I hope that's a decent kind of précis of some of the ideas, but I know there's a complexity.
They're very accurate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we should open up to a few questions.
Sure. Yeah.
If you have some questions.
It's hard to see beyond.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
I came last night and saw the show. Absolutely loved it. Partly why I'm back here tonight. Actually, lots of things immediately struck me when I was looking at all the pictures and the images downstairs. But actually, the whole thing about impermanence and dissolution was the first thing that struck me. And it actually had quite a strong effect on me, just that sense that I am seeing a representation of something that is actually happening. This dissolution, change, transformation is happening. And yet in these static pictures, it was happening as well. I was quite moved by it, actually. So that's my sense. It sounds like you bring that quite consciously into your work. Is that true?
It's interesting, this question around how conscious we are about. I mean, I think through the editing process ultimately is when, for example, having a conversation with Mila over the last, say, 6 months when thinking about this exhibition was a really terrific opportunity for all of us to understand that consciousness. Because, as Martin pointed out, we have a number of different projects going at once, and they may or may not touch more on that, but through the editing for an exhibition like this one, we can then sort of hone in on that dimension of it. So I think, for example, the video that Sammy mentioned in the back room was made quite recently as a real effort on our part to further our formal investigation into a visual language that will become evident about this question around impermanence. So how conscious was it? It's hard to say, but through conversation with Mila, we were able to make some decisions about how to bring that to the surface.
But I do think that there is a conscious effort from the beginning of the series, of the Synapse series and some of the Synaptic Bliss print series, a conscious effort to try to bring this notion of impermanence and movement and transformation and movement to a still right. Image.
Absolutely.
So that was definitely
a challenge.
And which led then, because these are not stills from a video. I mean, these are images that are created, composed, constructed, completely trying to capture that in the same way that in a way video allows itself much easier because it has a time element to it to express transformation. It comes natural to it, but in the still image freezes. So to try to go against that freezing, against that crystallization. But crystallization is actually a nice word because it's always in the process of forming somehow. Yeah.
It answers some of the questions in my mind about the choice of subject matter, because on the one hand I'm thinking, if you're dealing with the molecularization of the world out there, that includes everything. It's not, it's man-made structure, it's everything we can see or touch and can't even see and touch. But you've chosen certain motifs and subjects which are mostly about the natural world and don't seem to have any man-made structure in them. So, my question to you was going to be, well, why not anything? What drives the choice of subject matter?
Well, I would answer that by sort of extending again what we did with the bodies in our earlier work to this hybrid representation of the natural through a digital process. So this meeting point between the organic and the inorganic through this process, as we were doing with the bodies. But I think, again, through the design of this exhibition, we have the architecture and we have the landscape, and somewhere in there is the body. And I think that it's quite a vast picture that we're painting, in a sense, through the show that includes all three of those elements.
And the architecture functions like what you're saying as something also that dissolves and digitizes and all that. But because they are buildings, I mean, it would be somehow too easy, perhaps, to then take photographs of buildings and represent them. Do this to the buildings.
Redundant,
I think it would be perhaps redundant, and perhaps it would not then have the particularity of, even though everything is digitized and can be digitized, there is still a sense of that things are distinct, and that a building is a building and a landscape is a landscape. So we want to go into perhaps the specifics of what makes one and not the other. Yeah. So this modularity of these elements that are drawn, and we were very interested in bringing up the idea of drawing as part of the architectural language.
Right.
So they are drawn and then animated, justifies in a way, the choice of the medium.
Right. I think the body is also implied by you as the viewer. There's a scale to the images that
Yeah.
We talked about moving back and forth to them, and there is this kind of bodily engagement with the images. So you complete that as a viewer. You complete that kind of nature, culture, body perception idea. Yeah. And also, of course, they're very satisfyingly about fields. Many of them are fields or they're waves, and that's just a very satisfying motif.
Yeah. Those motifs, I think we are. I'm personally attracted to the fields because of the idea of infinity and of this idea that these things extend beyond the frame and they exist sort of outside of what we can put inside of our perception. There is something larger than that perception that kind of extends through the idea of the field.
Yes,
but you could also extend that by saying they are these very Edenic or idyllic views of a place that cannot exist, this utopian space in a sense.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for your question and your response. Okay.
Yes, my first impression when I saw the architectural downstairs was also how similar it looked to DNA, and I wanted to know whether you thought about the sacred geometry and the mathematics in nature in that sort of depth, where the scale is irrelevant.
The sacred geometry?
The mathematics in nature, and the hexagon.
Yeah. Not deliberately, I don't think.
Yeah,
no,
not deliberately. Not. I think that the shapes of the buildings came out of trying to quote or to make reference to certain modern architectural tropes, and perhaps those came out of this awareness of mathematics in nature, but not consciously from our part. They came out of another way of or another place. Yeah.
I sort of thought of September 11th. Was there any for the videos downstairs? It reminded me of September 11th.
Yeah, right.
Was there any thought of that, or is that just sort of?
We were in New York on that day, and we've all been impressed with the images that came out of that day and the horror of it. And maybe it took so many years later for us to grapple with that image and that memory, but it was really our research trip that we took through the former Yugoslavia when we came up with the idea of actually making this project, looking at the ruins and the relics of wartime Yugoslavia that still stand today, half built and half unbuilt. We're really struck with this dichotomy between development and sort of staying the same. And it wasn't until we started rendering them that we started to see the relationship to 9/11. It was certainly not the first initial intention of ours. We did not want to make a 9/11 piece, but it sort of came half circle back to that. And given that we are doing work about, in the exhibition at the Indianapolis Museum, work about conflict in the Middle East, things tend to just somehow circle back to that same narrative. Maybe not this work. Maybe you could make an argument for this, but the architecture work circles back to issues around conflict and resolution. And 9/11 is as much tied to what's going on in Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel as anything else is. And having been in New York that day, New York, the US, all of us are as implicated. So it's part of the narrative, but it's not a central part. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, you said it.
I mean, it does come up. I think what we will not do ever is show two panels with two buildings that are twins. That's never going to be our intention. I think what we've done downstairs is try to create a kind of cityscape or skyline that's very generic, that is more a picture of a kind of civilization that's growing and falling and growing again.
It also made me think of China and how quickly all the buildings are going up in China.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about that work downstairs that we've noticed is that every location that it's shown in will have a very different temperature to it. So cities that are growing up very quickly have a particular resonance. London, which has taken many centuries to build, has a slower kind of cook to it. We were in Miami 2 months ago showing it. Miami's been sort of up and down a lot over the last century. So the question around time and building becomes very specific to its location. It's interesting for us too.
I have one, but I'm afraid of the microphone. So I'll just speak. You talked a lot about transients and cycles and things coming around, and I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the sound downstairs and how you work with sound. I haven't seen your work in the Middle East.
Sorry, I think your question isn't going to be picked up by the... No.
Speaking of sound.
Yes, sound. Fear microphone, so I'm sorry. So the question was if you could talk a bit more about the sound and how you work with sound. I have not, sadly, seen your work about the Middle East, so I don't know about the sound in that piece, but maybe we could talk about both.
In our moving image work, sound plays a really big part, and it's very considered. And the sound downstairs is a specially commissioned white noise, basically. It's to me, it was an attempt to make it sound like New York sounds. And New York has a hum. There are so many machines happening in New York
that it becomes almost organic.
And we work, we collaborate with sound designers or composers to create the soundtracks for the pieces. For the most part, they are again electronic compositions and that mimic natural sounds. So there is a little bit of a correspondence to this idea of the natural being and the artificial kind of coming together. It's very in the other works the sound is used differently to bring you emotionally to certain places, but it's usually in a kind of, it's not music, but it's musically considered.
It's more systemic in a sense, that this audio in this case supports the visual effect of standing in front of it and almost becoming immersed in what you're seeing.
Yeah, in this case, adds to the organic feeling that we wanted to convey.
Do we have any other thoughts or comments, questions? You have one? Well, we'll just wait for the microphone if you do, please.
Hi, yes. There was that picture there, and there was a picture that actually was first on the screen that looked like a kind of...
It's the one back here.
Yeah, that's right, yes. To me, when I first saw it, it looked like a very early black and white picture that had been aqua tinted. But that behind that, there was this sense of spaciousness, actually. I mean, you talked about spaciousness in the pictures and trying to convey that. And that's actually what I got from it. And I just, in a way, I don't know quite what the question is there, but that whether there was some,
we talked about flattening, I think, more than spatializing with the photography. Yes, of course, there is this sense of perspective that you find in all of these landscape pieces, but at the same time, there is absolute clarity from foreground to background. And that was a very deliberate choice on our part in terms of the flattening of space. I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. I just wondered how people's attitudes towards digital photography as a tool has changed since you first started using it in the early 90s. Has there been a shift in accepting it as a equal tool, or has there been a different sort of attitude about producing photographs through using computers, basically?
I think it's an ongoing question that we've been asked and we've thought a lot about it. We're not married to it, as Sammy pointed out. For one thing, we sort of bounce around using different tools. I think when we first started working in the mid-90s, it was perplexing and mystifying and baffling and confounding and shocking at times. That shock has certainly not been the case in recent years. I think there's, if anything, probably been a backlash to all things digital, that there's a real attempt to conceal it.
I mean, for
to
me,
make
it's
the natural more foregrounded than the artificial, and what we've done is to sort of tear that up and make it explicit.
I mean, for me, it's like photography's always had this link with science, and it's sort of the very birth of photography had kind of scientific foundations. And what I find interesting about your work is you're sort of progressing that idea of technology and science and outer body things, if that makes sense. But I don't know. And it seems like very clearly linked with also the themes of things changing but staying the same. Like technologies can move on, but people can still be sort of medieval in their behaviours towards each other. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Just something I thought was interesting.
But I think the question of digital photography, I would ask Martin, where does the collecting it or archiving it or looking at it from in terms of this history that is canonized, where is it today?
But sorry, just to be clear, do you mean digital photography or digitally enhanced imagery that is clearly been the case? I think there are distinctions, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because digital photography, digitally enhanced photography. I guess what I'm talking about is the relationship between the scientific methods and sort of human expressive concepts or ideas or something, and how photography's roots seem to be kind of scientific. It's not really a question, it's more of a sort of speaking out loud, thinking out loud.
I think photography's had that from the beginning. It's had that it's occupied that very creative hinterland between optics, artistry, chemistry, magic and alchemy. All of those things make it what it is. Just a compelling thing that combines all those elements. But for me, in terms of, at the V&A, we've collected photography that had digital manipulation or digital printing more or less since it started. Some of it was more successful than others, and the work that seemed to be best to do it best was the work that kind of really engaged, like this work does, with choosing subject matter and ideas that could were best expressed using choosing that medium. So and the other thing to think about is that photography as a medium has almost like an inbuilt obsolescence in it. Every 10 to 15 years a new process arrives that seems to be better than the last one. So daguerreotypes get replaced by salted paper prints get replaced by glass negatives get replaced by gelatin silver and cellulose negatives, and so that the kind of change of technical ability and skill in the process often goes hand in hand with a change in aesthetics and ideas, and I see digital photography as like just another part in that ongoing story of inbuilt obsolescence in technical media that artists always creatively grapple with and make something exciting about, which is what's so great about artists using media that changes.
Yeah, I think there will always be this great pendulum when it comes to this question about how it has been received and perceived over the last, say, 20 years. Since we've been working with this material and grappling with it for as long as we have, that right now I think the pendulum has shifted in one direction, but I'm sure it will be coming back again with a new generation of young artists who will embrace it in a new way. I think when we started, we were absolutely fascinated and so entirely compelled to make sense of what we perceive to be a paradigm shift, not just in photography and how photography is made, but how we communicate and how we understand and how we share information. All of that was happening at that moment. So it was our duty, in a sense, to make work about it. And it just so happened that we could use those very same tools to do that with.
I think we probably better draw a line under our fascinating discussion and thank Mila and her lovely team for mounting a really beautiful show of Anthony and Sammy's work, and Anthony and Sammy being so open and articulate and engaging about your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Martin.
Thank you.